Okay, grade 11s, welcome to episode 4. Now, in this video, we will be covering a question that a lot of people, a lot of students are very, very intimidated by. Now, why do I say it's intimidating? Well, that's because there are a lot of different shapes combined in, different other shapes. So, what you're going to see is you're going to have circles combined with other circles, cyclic quads. It's a combination of all different types of quadrilaterals. And a lot of lines will be present and you're going to have different types of angles. And so now these are the questions we have to practice. Okay, we have to use these type of questions while we're practicing or while we are preparing for our final exams. Now, why is that? Well, that's because you're not going to see any progress. How are you going to track your progress? How will you be able to see where you are maybe stagnating in? How are you going to see and highlight where your weaknesses are or your strong areas are if you do not challenge yourself with questions that are asked on a higher level? And I'm not saying that that does not mean that this question is very difficult. It's not difficult. Okay, nothing's difficult when you keep doing it over and over again. Nothing. And so this is not a difficult question, but it is a question that just challenges your skills. It tests your ability to use all the knowledge and the logic that you've acquired throughout this entire year while practicing Euclidean geometry. That's what this question does. Okay, but without further ado, make sure you, and by the way, this is a brief overview. In order to get better at Euclidean geometry, you need to first learn how to evaluate and assess the diagram before continuing on. And that's exactly what I'll be doing in this video. But without further ado, let's continue. So question 11, DE is a tangent to the larger circle at E, DH is a tangent to the smaller circle at H. And so we can clearly see that they've mentioned tangents. We have two tangents, we have DE and DH. And so the minute you see any mention of tangents, you need to create a list, right? And on this list, there are going to be options of the different theorems that are related to tangents, okay? The very first theorem will be tangents from the same point, tangent perpendicular to radius, and tan-chord theorem. Now, they told us that we have DH and DE, and they both so happen to be tangents. So now it's pretty obvious that tangents from the same point will be applicable to this question. Now, why is that? Well, that's because we have two tangents that meet at the exact same point, and they also touch the circumference of the circle at a certain point, right? So we can clearly see that we have these tangents. They meet at the exact same point, and the actual or the end part of those tangent lines touch the circumference of the circle, and so they will be equal in length. Not only that, now by us identifying the fact that tangent from the same point is applicable to this question, as a result, we've also been able to identify an isosceles triangle. So DHE is an isosceles triangle, and so what that tells us is that H1 will be equal to E1 because of opposite angles equal sides. Since DH and DE are a part of an isosceles triangle, and we have H1, which is an angle that comes right after DH, and we have E1, which also comes right after DE1, will be equal to each other because of opposite angles equal sides. So I just want to mark that off. H1 equals to E1. Now let's continue on. What about tangent perpendicular to radius? So we need to break down this question. We need to break it into two parts. Okay, we need to pay very close attention to the title that the theorem has. It's tangent perpendicular to radius. So that means we have to identify a tangent and we have to identify radius. We have two tangents. We have DH and DE. Do we have any radii? No. Now, how do we know? How can we know for sure that we don't have any radius? Well, you need to first understand what a radius is. And so if you don't have a center, how can you have a radius? No center, no radius. Okay, so that's how it works. Now, why is that? Well, because the very definition of a radius is that it's a line that stems from the center and touches the circumference of the circle. And so if there's no center, then they can't be a radius. Okay, so yeah. um, so that means tangent perpendicular to radius will not be applicable. What about tan-chord? Same thing. Just look at the different parts of the title. We have a tangent and a chord. It involves both a tangent and a chord. So you need to identify a tangent and identify a chord. So we have two tangents. We have DE and DH. Then you need to identify a chord, and the chord has to be close to the tangent. Okay, the chord cannot be all the way over here. No. So if the tangent is here and your chord is here, obviously it's not going to apply. That's not the chord you're going to use. And so the chord that we will be using would be KE, because KE is close to the tangent, which is DE. And then you want to identify the next steps of the process, because this is a process that we are following. The angle, you need to identify the angle between the tangent and the chord. And the angle between the tangent and the chord is E1. The second step to the process would be the fact that you have to identify the angle that the chord, that in this case KE, identify the angle that the chord subtends. What does it mean to subtend? You see, and students don't even know what subtend, what it means to subtend. They don't even know this, okay? And so how do you expect to successfully use the tan chord theorem? How do you expect to apply this to certain questions if you don't even know what a chord is? Or not even a chord, if you don't even know what it means to subtend. No, that's the very foundation of being able to understand tan chord. To subtend, you need to know what that is. And so just to make it as easy as possible, just follow this process. What you need to do is first trace the lines that stem from both ends of the chord. So I'm going to start here on this end of the chord. So I'm going to trace the lines all the way to the other end of the circumference of the circle. It ends right over here. And it has to end right here by the circumference of the circle. It's the same thing. This would be F. Okay, and then do the exact same thing on the other side. Trace the lines from the other end of the chord. Trace it all the way to the circumference of the circle. It also ends right over here, right by F1. And so the angle between those two lines, in this case the brown lines, will be equal to E1. And this is the line it subtends. To subtend means that the chord holds another angle to the other part of the circumference of the circle, but that angle has to touch the circumference of the circle. That's the only difference. And so that's very, very important. Okay, so now we're just going to mark that off. We calculate. That's very easy. So now we know that E1 equals to K1. So you can this part over here, this is another part of the diagram, by the way, since there's a lot going on. But yeah, so E1 equals to K1. So we want to do this on the exact same on the other side as well. So what about H1? Same thing, identify your tangent, identify your chord. In this case, our tangent would be DH, chord will be KH. KH is the chord that is closest to the tangent. In this case, we will be using DH as our tangent. You want to follow the exact same process of identifying your chord. Chord is KH, then identify the angle between the tangent and the chord, which is H1, and then identify the angle that HK subtends. You want to follow that exact same process that I used previously, where you'll take your pencil and trace the lines from both ends of the chord until it touches the circumference of the circle. So we want to trace it, trace it, trace it. It ends right over here. Do the exact same thing on the other side. Trace it, trace it, trace it, trace it, trace it. It ends over here. So what does that mean? That means that HK subtends F2. By the way, this is supposed to be F. You can clearly see that on the other part of the diagram. That's supposed to be F. So that means H1 equals to F2 because HK subtends F2. And if HK subtends F2, H1 will equal to F2 because of the tan chord theorem. And so what we want to do is we just want to label them as being equal to each other. I'm just going to annotate them using the exact same color. All right, so it's very easy when you follow that process. H2. Okay, so now what is the next step? And you can clearly see that all of these angles so happen to have the exact same color. Well, because they're equal to each other in an indirect way. You know, we said that E1 equals to F1, and then we said that H1 equals to E1 because of opposite angles equal sides, and then we saw that H1 equals to H2, meaning that F2 could equal to F1. But anyways, let's continue on. Okay, so now, are we done using the tan chord theorem to connect two angles to each other? Are we? Okay, because remember, tangent, we need to have your tangent, then you need to have your chord. I don't want anyone, so we know a lot of students do, they make this mistake of thinking that just because it looks like a tangent, what they do is they look for a certain part where you'd have a segment and then it will look like maybe there's a line. You cannot assume that that's where tan chord theorem will be applicable. No, just because you see a part of the diagram that looks similar to it doesn't mean that it's applicable. And so students might think, oh, what about K4? No, K4 is not going to work because you need a chord and a tangent. Okay, and here's your tangent, there's your chord. Okay, your tangent isn't anywhere close to K4. You need your tangent that literally passes and touches right by this angle, and then you need that chord. Okay, so I don't want anyone to make that mistake. So now let's continue on. They tell us that chord HK extends to meet the largest circle at E, F, and K are points of the intersections between circles. FK produced to D, GK is a chord of the smaller circle, with FE a chord of the larger circle, and then we have HF, GH, and GF. Okay, so now those are the only statements that they've given us about any Euclidean theorems. But well, there is something that you have to remember. Now, before you begin, you need to identify, you need to remind yourself of the other general geometrical theorems like exterior angle of a triangle, sum of angles of a triangle, vertical opposite angles, and angles on a straight line. But not only that, sometimes there are cyclic chords that are present in the diagram, but they will not outline that in the segment above. They're actually not going to tell you that. And so sometimes they do not tell you that, because they want you to do that on your own. They want you to identify the cyclic chord on your own. So before we continue on, what we want to do is we want to identify any cyclic chords. A lot of people might think that HF, this is HFE is a cyclic, no, sorry, HDEF is a cyclic chord. It's not a cyclic chord. It's not a cyclic chord. Why is it not a cyclic chord? Because all four sides of the shape or of this quadrilateral doesn't touch the circumference of the circle, okay? So when it comes to a cyclic chord, if a quadrilateral, if it's a cyclic quadrilateral, all four sides of that shape has to touch the circumference of the circle. You can clearly see that H and D do not touch this. There is no circle. Actually, they don't even form a part of a circle. So that's completely incorrect. Now, G, H, K, let me just go back and highlight this for you. I'm just going to go back and highlight this. H, G, K, F is a cyclic quad. You can clearly see that all four sides of the shape touch the circumference of the circle. And so what we want to do is we just want to remind ourselves of the theorems, the cyclic quad theorems, which would be angles in the same segment, exterior angle of a cyclic quad, and opposite angles of a cyclic quad are equal to 180 degrees. Let's start off with angles in the same segment. Now what you want to do is you want to look for that bow tie shape. Okay, so we can clearly see that we have a bow tie shape right over here. And that means that H3 and K2 will equal to each other because they're in the same segment. And what you know what a lot of students do? A lot of students neglect to change their perspective or the angle that they're looking at the picture from. So they will only look at it from a vertical perspective. So they would only pay attention to H3 and K2 and G2 and F2 while ignoring H2 and G1 and ignoring F3 and K1. You need to just tilt your head a little bit and view it from a different angle and perspective. Okay, and so what we know is G2 will also equal to F2, okay, and H2 equals to G1, K1 equals to F3. Okay, F3 equals to K1. So we've identified all the angles that are equal to each other because of angles in the same segment. What are what angles? Exterior angle of a cyclic quad. We want to identify any angle that is at the exterior of the cyclic quad. So a lot of students might think that, well, first and foremost, this would be applicable though if this was an actual angle. They did not label it, so it is safe to assume that that is not applicable. That's something to ignore. Now, I don't want students to think H1. No, it's not H1. Now, why isn't H1? Because it has to be on a straight line. A lot of students may also think that F1 will equal to H2 plus H3 because of exterior angles of a cyclic quad, which is not true. Why is it not true? Because F1 is not on a straight line. It has to be a straight line. Okay, so no, exterior angle of a cyclic quad is not applicable to this question. It's not applicable to this question, okay? So now continuing on, what about opposite angles equal to 180 degrees? That is something that we're just going to keep in mind. So we're just going to keep that in mind. Now, the last thing is vertically opposite angles, angles on a straight line. Okay, so let's identify. So we can see that if this angle was labeled, that angle over here would equal to K3 because of vertically opposite angles. We can clearly see that K4 and K1 plus K2 will equal to each other because of vertically opposite angles. And yeah, those are all the angles that are equal to each other because of vertically opposite angles. Yeah. Okay. Hopefully you found this video very helpful. This was just a brief analysis, a brief analysis and evaluation on this specific question of this specific Euclidean question. In the next video, we will be answering the questions in very thorough steps, and hopefully you found it very helpful. Now, if you would like to gain access to the actual PDF questions, make sure that you contact us, because you cannot, obviously, guys, when you write your final exams, you will not receive your exam paper in its digital form. No, it will be in its printed form. And so you need to practice. It's very different to watch a video. Okay, so you might think it's very easy when you watch a video, but when you try and do it on your own with a piece of paper, annotating everything, using all the colors that you will require, it will be very different. And so you do want to, when you're practicing for your exams, for your final exams, you want to try and mimic the situations, the environmental situations that you will probably be in and experience while you're in exam. So what does that mean? That means you need to have your exam paper, you need to have it printed. Because in the exam, what's going to happen? You're going to have it printed. You're going to have your exam paper in its printed form. Okay? But without further ado, hopefully you enjoyed this video. We will see you in the next video.